Everyone is playing Balatro. The poker roguelike has amassed an enormous following, sold over 1 million copies, and is lauded by critics. It is, without a doubt, an instant classic in the roguelike deck building genre, which was beginning to see some stagnancy. But how did this solo developed game gather such a huge following? How can a game even become a classic? And what impact is Balatro going to have on roguelikes in general over the next few years? Stick around, this game marks the beginning of not only an entirely new genre, but it will have ripple effects throughout the entire game industry. For game developers, getting your game out into the public eye is a notoriously difficult task. Over 10,000 games are released on Steam each year. Most of these games fly completely under the radar for your average player. Indie developers don't have huge marketing budgets and can't afford to spend all their time trying to get a viral tweet or Reddit post. Local Thunk was one of these developers. Investing time and money into marketing is a risky gamble, and being uncertain about the quality of your product makes it even more difficult to take this risk. Local Thunk noted that even when the game was gaining success, he still felt he was unable to see what most players saw in the game. He'd been developing games for around a decade, often distributing them among 3 of his close friends to play together. It was truly just a passion for him, which made it easy to do after work or on the weekends, as it never felt like a chore. Balatro was mainly inspired by a poker-like game called Big 2. The first iteration of Balatro had players combining cards to increase their strength and play higher scoring cards. After some time trying to make it work, Local Thunk expressed it didn't just quite click in the way he hoped it would. He then introduced the jokers we know and love today, starting with Jimbo. He redistributed the game amongst his friends, hoping for a good response. He started to realize he had something special when one of them told Local Thunk that they had played the game for over 20 hours. That is not normal. At this stage, the game was still incredibly bare bones and only had a few jokers and the core poker mechanics, but still, one of his friends played it for over 20 hours. Local Thunk realized he might have stumbled across a game good enough for Steam. It was his first game on Steam. Despite developing many games in the past, none of them saw the light of the public eye. The first encounter I had with Balatro was a post on the Love2D subreddit. Love2D is the framework Balatro is made in, and although it is incredibly capable, there are very few commercial releases made with it. He indicated that the demo was free to download, so I gave it a go. Now, I'm sure many, if not all of you, have played Balatro, and so you'd know something the game has done incredibly well from the beginning is polish. Everything has a bit of movement to make it feel as if you're really playing on a 3D board. Cards have effects that shimmer rainbows or add an inverted shine, or seem as if the cards themselves have a foil. The art in Balatro is also done incredibly well, and I'm sure it's no surprise to any of you that Local Thunk was actually a pixel artist before developing games. So when I downloaded the demo, I was absolutely blown away. Not only was the core gameplay incredibly fun, it was addictive, looked amazing, and felt fantastic to play. I catch a bus to and from work, and the game was so fun that I missed my stop multiple times because I was so immersed in racking up a huge score in Balatro. This was around halfway through last year. So I tweeted my admiration for the game and joined the Discord server, which at that time was probably no more than about 100 members. Everyone in the server echoed similar praise to me, expressing their enjoyment for their game and enthusiasm for the full release. At this time, Local Thunk was blown away with the reception of the demo. He tweeted his thankfulness for the 80 people who were playing the demo. Oh, young Local Thunk, if only you knew. He put the demo up to coincide with the Steam Next Fest during June of last year, and although he wasn't technically enrolled in it, he began to see a bit more coverage. It started with people like me who discovered the game through Twitter or Reddit. Then it began getting a bit of playtime from YouTubers. I remember watching Alexa's video on the game and thinking, oh, this shit is gonna be huge. Speaking of YouTubers, don't forget to absolutely pummel that subscribe button. It helps out a huge amount and is absolutely free. And then Northern Lion played it, and that's where shit really hit the fan. His video saw hundreds of thousands of views, and the Discord's growth became exponential. Through simple word of mouth, the game had found its way into the hands of the biggest roguelike streamer on Twitch and YouTube. Local Thunk was receiving multiple publishing offers at the time, like sharks circling around the hit creation Balatro. Getting this massive attention led Local Thunk to hire a lawyer to look over these publishing deals, revenue splits, marketing potential, and general roadmaps for Balatro's release. Local Thunk just didn't have the time to do community management, as well as develop the game and ensure a stable release. He ended up partnering with PlayStack because of their idea for the trajectory of the game's release, and the specific marketing beats that go along with the release of the soon-to-be hit hit game. He hunkered down and went back to dev mode, polishing content for the next demo in February and fixing bugs that came along with the huge influx of players. During this time, the game was being played by streamers running competitions to see who could rack up the highest scores. Balatro saw huge numbers during the Steam Next Fest, becoming one of the most played and wishlisted games of the festival. The hype for release was huge, and players were constantly discovering the game and being blown away with its polished and satisfying gameplay. Despite being only a demo, Balatro had a huge amount of content. On Steam, its recommended demos have about 30 to 60 minutes of gameplay. Balatro's demo provided hours and hours of content for players to sink their teeth into. But with all this massive hype, there was still a lingering fear. Could the game live up to the huge expectations of the players? What if they gave away too much with the demo and people didn't care to buy the full game? What if it all fell apart on release? It was February the 20th, 2024. February the 21st if you live in upside down land like me. The release button was pressed. I can't even imagine the concoction of emotions that local Thunk must have felt for this time. Honestly, he seems like a pretty chill guy, so maybe he just cruised through it. So, the button was pressed and the reviews started flooding in. The game sold over 250,000 copies in the first 72 hours, turning local Thunk into a millionaire overnight. All the hard work, brilliant decision making, and passion was finally paying off. People loved the game. A month later, it had sold over 1 million copies, meaning local Thunk could spend the rest of his life making games if he wanted to, with a huge security net. But what were the reviews actually saying? If we take a look through the reviews of these first few days, a lot of them are pretty funny. People joke about their addiction, the game's polish, and the massive success. But this one stood out to me in particular. I have no idea how to explain why this game is addictive and interesting. It feels like poker with extra steps and abilities. Highly recommend this game. People loved the game but weren't incredibly sure why. It's easy to say a few reasons. Of course, it feels great to play. I think I've said that 1 million times at this point. The card movement is satisfying, the sound effects tickle our brains, and the atmosphere is perfectly matching with the gameplay. But still, it's difficult to articulate what about the gameplay works so well. I think it does a few things quite well, so let's break it down. Starting with something that works. Balatro is a poker-based roguelike. Poker has been around for over 200 years at this point, so people are pretty familiar with how it works. But more importantly, it's gone through rigorous playtesting over generations to fine-tune it into a specific list of hand types. Balatro doesn't reinvent the wheel. It takes the satisfying feeling of luck-based gameplay found in poker and modernizes it with the roguelike formula. Roguelikes are notorious for being the perfect playing field for developers to create an amalgam of pre-existing genres with items, satisfying gameplay, and the potential to become incredibly powerful. If we think back to some of the most successful roguelikes of all time, we can pretty easily see their inspiration. Slay the Spire has many similarities with a classic deck builder board game like Dominion. Dead Cells takes the fun in discovering a Metroidvania-like map and adds satisfying movement and roguelike progression. Even Binding of Isaac, a staple in the genre, takes inspiration from the classic Legend of Zelda game with its top-down combat and rectangular rooms. By taking something that works and running with it, local Thunk ensured that he didn't have to worry about the core of the game not being fun. Gambling will always be fun, and even more so when you can play it with the odds. We saw it work with Luck Be a Landlord, and I imagine we'll see even more of it in the future. 2. Limitations. It seems kind of counterintuitive for limitations to be something that makes a game more fun. You'd think in a survival game, the last thing you'd want is to be bound to a small area. Or in a game like Risk of Rain, it'd be really strange to limit the number of items you're allowed. But in Balatro, there are tons of numerical limitations that restrict the player right off the bat. The amount of jokers, consumable slots, hands, and discards. But creativity flourishes in limitations. Constricting the player to certain rules means that they are encouraged to think creatively to make the most of what they have. This might mean using your last discard in the hope of getting the jack of diamonds you need for a straight flush. Or it might mean selling your most powerful joker for one that will grow more powerful, but is immediately a lot worse. You don't have infinite space or infinite hands to play, so playing with these constraints means that the strategy is required with each and every decision, because you can only do it so many times. And with each limitation Balatro provides, there's often a joker, enhancement, or voucher that can overcome it. Playing with these restrictions makes it so much more rewarding to find a way to bypass them and unlock even more power. and it never completely frees you from these restrictions. It only ever gives you a bit more wiggle room. Maybe one extra Joker slot or one additional hand to each round. Something that's not a free pass to victory, but an extra layer of strategy to consider. And with the huge amount of content in Balatro, it's imperative that items can work well together. I like to distinguish synergies into two variants, natural and specialized. A natural synergy is when two things just happen to work really well together, without any work from the developer. For example, in my game Fish TDX, a rabbit foot shoots a little faster each time it lands a critical shot. Then the lucky clover makes a tower much more likely to land a critical shot. Thus, combining the two is a fantastic synergy, however, there is no hard-coded interaction between them. A specialized synergy is when the developer has created a specific interaction between two items. In The Binding of Isaac, there's a huge item pool. Sometimes the effects of these items is so great that certain interactions aren't intuitive. For example, Brimstone shoots a huge laser from the player's mouth. Then there's the item Ludovico Technique, which replaces the player's tears with a singular projectile controlled by the player. But how does this work when the player no longer shoots tears and instead shoots a laser beam? Well, it creates a ring created from Brimstone that does heaps of damage to enemies. This interaction likely didn't arise naturally, and required some programming from the developers to ensure something logical occurred when a player got both of these items. Balatro is a unique case because the vast majority of interactions between Jokers are natural. Getting a good build requires the player to think logically about which Jokers would work well together. It can sometimes happen, like the blueprint is not allowed to copy the effects of certain Jokers, which is decided by local thunk, but most of the time the interactions between Jokers, card types, consumables, and vouchers are natural. Having this foundation that enables this not only means that it's less work on the developer, but it makes the game far more intuitive for the players. The Jokers are written with incredibly simple language and do exactly what they say they do. There's little room for ambiguity, and even the most powerful still have relatively straightforward effects. And so these three pillars, among with a million other things, play an enormous role in establishing Balatro not only as a fun and satisfying game, but one that you're likely to come back to again and again and again and again. And now we know how it became an instant classic. But what does that mean for the future of the genre? What does that mean for the future of Balatro? Well, it's not quite as simple as it seems. Balatro's impact on video games will raise some very important questions. It teaches certain lessons about game development, marketing, and likely introduce a new way of thinking about roguelikes. In the past few years, roguelikes have been released incredibly often, and they take a genre and put a roguelike spin on it. I'll plug my own roguelike here. Fish TDX is a tower defense roguelike. If you've watched the video this far, I can pretty much guarantee that you'll enjoy Fish TDX. It's another cool genre blend with plenty of potential for broken builds and risk-reward decisions. Give it a wishlist now if you haven't already, and check out the demo that's available now. Balatro's legacy is akin to that of Stardew Valleys or Undertales. It's a hard-to-swallow pill for many developers, including myself, but it's that good games can sell themselves. They don't require constant marketing, all they need is good gameplay, and word of mouth can do the rest. But what impact will Balatro leave on the gaming industry? How will you, as a player, be affected? Well, I believe there are a few things that are about to happen. The first thing is that gambling elements will become more prevalent. We've already seen this with the rise of Vampire Survivors that tickles your dopamine receptors. However, now we'll see entire games based around gambling mechanics. I'm sure we'll get other versions of poker, as well as blackjack, roulette, slot machines, and maybe even bingo. Some of these already exist, but I have the feeling we're going to see a few more. This isn't necessarily a good or bad thing, but it'll certainly happen because of the huge success of Balatro. And in a similar vein, we'll also see more roguelikes inspired by classic, easily understood games. Things like Monopoly, Yahtzee, Scrabble already have incredibly solid foundations with fantastic variables to fiddle around with for a curious developer. Imagine a Yahtzee game where you control the different sides of your dice, or a Scrabble game with special tiles that grant certain effects. We've seen plenty of chess roguelikes, and so it's time to see that same experimentation expand across all board games. I certainly think this is a good thing. These games are not only easy to understand, but they already have a fun foundation to build upon. Balatro specifically will prove to be a haven for modders. Similar to The Binding of Isaac or Slay the Spire, Balatro provides an incredibly broad playing field for modders with a huge amount of potential. Already we're seeing huge expansive mods released for the game on the Discord server, even though there's no official modding support. The foundation of Balatro is so full of potential that there'll be some huge mods in the future, similar to the effect that Antibirth had on the Binding of Isaac community. And finally, Balatro's legacy will be fueled by a constantly alive community. Seldom can roguelikes maintain a community after developers have moved on, but the huge potential of Balatro's modding, in addition to how fantastic it feels to pick up and play at any point, will mean that it will certainly last for a while. Once the planned mobile release comes out, all productivity in the world will slow to a halt as CEOs and teachers alike attempt to beat the gold stake difficulty. Balatro's legacy, however, does raise an interesting discussion, for it's not a truly perfect legacy, as there are some certain elements of Balatro that will certainly raise the eyebrows of many parents. There's certainly some other reason why you really can't stop playing Balatro. But there's something else. There's another reason why you really can't stop playing Balatro. That is gambling. I mean, you knew it was coming. Balatro is a game based on gambling mechanics and is so addictive partly because of this. It's an old conversation now, but I don't think a conclusion has necessarily been reached. I know a lot of people see it as black and white. You're not gambling any money, so it's no issue. But I wish it were that simple. In 2019, an article was published in the Journal of Gambling Studies entitled, "Are Video Games a Gateway to Gambling?" A longitudinal study based on a representative Norwegian sample. My first thought when I read this was, what the hell is a longitudinal study? Well, it's a study conducted over a period of time to measure the lasting impacts of something. My second thought was, well, is it true? So in 2013, the authors collected a sample of 4,601 individuals who had played video games during the previous 6 months and/or had participated in gambling activities during the past 12 months. The participants completed a questionnaire intended to gauge their experience with video games, gambling, and addiction. The same participants were contacted again in 2015, 2 years later, to fill the same questionnaire to understand how the habits of these participants had changed. They found out a few things. Participants from the first wave who did excessive gaming went on to have a relatively high likelihood of gambling in the second wave. But most interestingly, they found that the participants' gaming habits at Wave 1 predicted the gambling problems at Wave 2. This suggests that video gaming constituted a risk factor for gambling 2 years later. They outlined a few reasons why this relationship could exist. They initially postulate it could simply be the participants aging 2 years and thus gambling where before they couldn't. However, the median age for participants was 48. Then they suggest something far more relevant to us. I'll read right from the article now. Another set of factors possibly augmenting such a trajectory is the increasing convergence between video gaming and gambling. This trend manifests itself, for example, in an increasing number of gambling products that adopt features from video games, and also more video games containing intrinsic gambling themes. As with all psychological studies, the results were far from conclusive and, if anything, raise even more questions than we started with. But there's no debating that gambling and video games are certainly tied together. In my opinion, suggesting that a game like Balatro will certainly lead people to gambling is not only a baseless accusation, but one that can cause a lot of ethical dilemmas for players and developers everywhere. Instead, I'll remind you of what happened with vaping. In 2003, a Chinese pharmacist invented the first e-cigarette, intending to serve as an alternative to conventional smoking. They began to be introduced worldwide to slowly reduce a smoker's reliance on nicotine until their vape contains no nicotine. However, as vapes became more popular, teenagers and young adults began using them as they didn't necessarily have the drastic side effects that smoking tobacco has. Through recent studies, we've seen findings that suggest adolescents who vape are 3 times more likely to use cigarettes later in life. A substitute became a gateway. I was going to end the video there, but I think it'd be a bit morbid to do so. I think the discussion around gambling and video games is incredibly important, especially considering that the general population seems to be unaware of these findings. Just because a video game doesn't include actual money, it can still inspire gambling tendencies. At the end of the day, Balatro is an absolutely fantastic game. Sure, it may have begun with a gambling mechanic, but it grew to become a fine-tuned strategy game that has provided an absurd amount of content to players. Simply put, Balatro became an instant classic because it is an incredibly good game. Don't forget to give Fish TDX a wishlist and try out the demo. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.